In front of dozens of onlookers, she humiliated a man she believed to be worthless, a black vagrant occupying her favorite bench in the park. But when he shed his tattered coat and a hidden observer revealed him as a decorated war hero and community leader, her world crumbled in an instant. The crowd turned against her. Cameras caught every humiliating second, and her excuses only condemned her further. What happened next would shock even the most jaded. But let's start from the beginning. The city park was Karen's sanctuary, a curated slice of perfection amidst an imperfect world. Its manicured flower beds and perfectly trimmed hedges offered her a reprieve from the chaos she avoided so diligently. The orderly rows of benches and the neatly swept cobblestone paths reflected her own ideal of how the world should be, polished, controlled, and predictable. Today, however, that sense of order was marred. As Karen rounded the corner, her usual bench, the one perfectly positioned beneath a shade tree with a clear view of the fountain, was occupied. A homeless black man was sprawled across it, his head resting against a bundle of clothes that doubled as his pillow. His coat was worn and patched in places, and his boots, once sturdy, bore the cracks of long, unrelenting miles. Karen's polished heels clicked sharply against the stones as she marched toward the bench, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her carefully crafted morning routine, park stroll, iced coffee, and quiet reflection, was now disrupted. As she approached, the man stirred, perhaps sensing her piercing glare. "This is a public park," Karen snapped, her voice loud and sharp enough to slice through the ambient chatter of the park. A few heads turned, some out of curiosity, others in quiet disapproval. "You don't belong here." The man shifted upright, his face weathered but composed. Deep lines etched his cheeks, hinting at years of hardship, but his eyes carried a quiet dignity. He glanced at her, his expression neither confrontational nor submissive. "I'm sorry if I'm disturbing you, ma'am. I'll leave," he said, his deep voice steady, yet tinged with weariness. But Karen wasn't satisfied. As he began to gather his meager belongings, a crumpled blanket and a paper bag, Karen stepped closer, pulling her phone from her designer purse. No, this isn't enough," she said, her voice rising. A cruel smile tugged at her lips as she began recording. "This is exactly why this city's going downhill. People like you, taking up space and ruining it for the rest of us." The man paused, his hands tightening around his belongings. He didn't respond. Instead, he straightened his shoulders, his silence a quiet act of defiance against her tirade. Nearby, a jogger slowed his pace, pretending to stretch near a tree. His running gear was nondescript, blending him seamlessly into the park's backdrop. Yet his wrist bore a discreet camera, the lens aimed at Karen and the man on the bench. He adjusted it subtly, ensuring he captured every moment. Karen continued her rant, oblivious to the growing tension in the air and the subtle disapproval in the glances of passers-by. The man remained stoic, a silent storm brewing behind his eyes. The jogger's hand moved carefully, ensuring his footage remained steady. Unbeknownst to Karen, her words were no longer her own. They were evidence. Karen's voice rang out sharply, cutting through the tranquil hum of the park like a blade. "What do you even contribute to society?" she sneered, her words laced with venom. A small crowd had begun to form, some pausing their morning routines to watch the unfolding scene. A mother pushing a stroller stopped mid-path, her lips pressed into a disapproving line. A group of teens paused their chatter, whispering as they pulled out their phones to record. The man on the bench moved slowly, each motion deliberate. He rose to his feet, clutching a bundle of worn clothes under his arm. His expression remained calm, but unreadable, as if her words had long lost the power to sting. "More than you know, ma'am," he replied softly, his voice steady and even. Without another glance at Karen, he turned to leave, his meager belongings clutched tightly to his chest. Karen seemed momentarily thrown off by his composure, but her indignation quickly reignited. She opened her mouth to speak again, but before she could, a man stepped forward from the crowd. Dressed in athletic wear, he looked like just another jogger taking a break. His voice, however, was anything but casual. "Do you feel good about yourself?" he asked pointedly, his tone cutting. Karen blinked, her expression shifting from irritation to confusion. "Excuse me?" she snapped, though her voice carried a flicker of uncertainty. "You just humiliated someone for no reason," the jogger continued, his sharp tone drawing gasps from the onlookers. He gestured toward the homeless man, now only a few steps away. "And it's all on camera." Karen's face drained of color, her carefully maintained facade cracking. "Who are you to judge me?" she shot back, but her voice wavered, betraying her unease. The jogger didn't flinch. "Someone who doesn't stand by while people like you belittle others," he replied. He raised his arm, revealing the small camera strapped to his wrist. "This, ma'am, is going to show the world who you really are." Karen's hands clenched around her phone, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. She opened her mouth to argue, but before she could form a defense, another voice joined the fray. "Excuse me, ma'am." The voice was calm, authoritative. A man in a tailored blazer stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking softly on the cobblestones. His presence commanded attention, and the small crowd turned to face him. Karen's gaze darted between the jogger, the homeless man, and the newcomer. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice tinged with panic. "This," the man in the blazer began, gesturing toward the jogger and the homeless man, who had now stopped a few feet away, "is a social experiment." He paused, his sharp gaze settling on Karen. "You were being recorded to test reactions to homelessness and prejudice." Karen's jaw fell open, her protests stuck in her throat. The crowd murmured in shock, some shaking their heads in quiet judgment. Karen's gaze flicked to the onlookers, her carefully crafted image crumbling under the weight of their disapproval. The homeless man stood quietly, watching the scene with an expression of quiet resilience, as if he had seen it all before. For Karen, the truth was a mirror she couldn't look away from. Karen froze, her sharp retort dying in her throat as the man in the blazer continued. His voice was steady but firm, each word hitting like a hammer. "The person you just berated isn't actually homeless. He's a decorated veteran and a respected community leader. He's working with us to raise awareness about societal bias and how we treat the most vulnerable among us." A ripple of shock ran through the crowd. A few onlookers exchanged stunned glances, while others gasped audibly. Karen's face flushed crimson, her confident composure unraveling under the weight of the revelation. Her mouth opened and closed as she grasped for something, anything, to say. The man she had mocked removed his tattered coat slowly, shaking it off his shoulders to reveal a crisp button-up shirt underneath. The transformation was jarring. The man who once seemed downtrodden now exuded an air of dignity and self-assurance. He turned to Karen, his eyes meeting hers with quiet intensity. "Ma'am," he began, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable authority. "I hope today makes you think about how you treat people, regardless of what you assume about them." Karen's chest tightened. She stumbled over her words, her voice rising with desperation. "Wait, this isn't fair," she stammered. "I didn't know. It's not my fault." But the murmurs from the crowd drowned her out. Phones were held high, their cameras capturing every humiliating moment. A young woman whispered to her friend, "Can you believe this?" While an older man shook his head in silent disappointment. Karen felt the weight of 100 eyes on her, their judgment suffocating. For the first time, she realized there would be no escaping the consequences of her actions. The following day, Karen's face was all over social media, the video amassing thousands of views and comments, condemning her actions. At work, her co-workers avoided her, and her boss called her in for a stern meeting. Meanwhile, the homeless man, now revealed as Greg Johnson, sat down for an interview on a local news channel. He spoke about his experiences, not just from the social experiment, but also from his work advocating for marginalized communities. As for Karen, the shame of her actions weighed heavily. In a rare moment of self-reflection, she reached out to Greg, offering a genuine apology and asking how she could help. Though forgiveness wouldn't come easily, Greg's advice was simple. Start by changing how you see people, not just in public, but in your heart.